Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce Workforce Committee today. We have a wonderful series of webinars that we're going to continue to present for your education and for all of our well-being. And this one is a fantastic webinar today on legal updates and some very hot topics. I am Tammy Davidson. I'm the EVP of Client Services of the Florida Caribbean region of Right Management. And Right Management, if you don't know me or what we do, we are the leading outplacement firm and leading talent solutions firm in coaching, assessments, and all types of other wonderful talent things that you can dream up and educate and lead people through. If you are not linked in with me, I encourage you to do that. Because all these kinds of information I can send to you and we can get to you and give you all kinds of wonderful updates. But without further ado, I do want to make a public service announcement. Alicia, if you would be so kind as to show the picture that we need to share with everybody for a moment. If you do see this in your neighborhood, my friends, please call animal control. We have seen that with all this rain, we have a few friends from the ocean that might join us. So please call animal control. Thank you, Alicia. But in all seriousness, I hope that you're well and staying dry, and we will get through this like Floridians always do. We are resilient. So with that, we have some wonderful sponsors today. We have CareerSource as a presenting sponsor, and Diana Belvita is the business service managers of CareerSource. And Diana, I'd like you to say a few words about CareerSource and what you may offer.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Tammy, for that introduction. Happy to be here. Happy to be part of the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce and the wonderful things that they do. So again, Diana Divya with Business Services Manager, and basically CareerSource South Florida is your Miami-Dade County Workforce Development Board, and we basically help the city with state-funded programs that can assist your business to offset the costs that be in recruiting, in upskilling current employees, new hires. There are several state-funded programs that can assist your business in scaling your business and in growing your business in this ever-changing market. And right now, the need for employers
Well, we lost Diana. I hope it wasn't because of that.
I'm back.
Well,
I'm back.
Okay, and Diana, we got to the part where you assist employers in their upskilling and their needs, and we're very excited to have you here today.
Definitely. Yes. Sorry about that. I guess I had a connectivity issue there. I kind of lost you guys for a second, but I'm back. Again, my apologies. So basically, yes, I was mentioning that CareerSource South Florida can assist the community, can assist the businesses to scale their business, grow their business with our state-funded programs, offsetting those costs that are associated with recruiting, upskilling. There are programs, for example, if you're looking for an interim, providing an opportunity for an individual that is into that industry, the field, or that role. You want to save on, we can definitely help with saving on costs with the programs, the state-funded programs that we have. All of the services to the business community is at no charge. There's no fees for any of the services that we provide. So definitely, I implore businesses in the community reach out to contact CareerSource South Florida and see what program.
Okay. we lost her again, but that's okay. We will go forward. We thank her for that. The next person would be Florida Blue. We thank them for being a sponsor, as event sponsor. And we could not thank Berry University and our dear friend Tiffany enough for the SHRM credits that are available for this webinar. And we know it's going to be very exciting. Joining me today is Aaron Tandy. Aaron Tandy has been the vice chair of our committee. I've been the chair. And next year he will take over as the chair of the committee. And then I will come and serve with Aaron and continue to serve on this great board of directors. I'm a director at large now in the chamber, and that's very exciting. But Aaron is in-house counsel for Boucher Brothers. Now, if you've ever been to our beaches, not today or yesterday, but if you've ever been to our beaches, Boucher Brothers is one of the largest employers in Miami Beach. You have been under one of those umbrellas and with his staff, and they're fabulous. And he, prior to joining the team in just 2023, he is a legal eagle, as I call him. 30 years of a litigator and employment lawyer in New York and South Florida. He's worked across the United States. He's very active in the Chamber of Commerce in Miami Beach. He served as the past chair, and he is very active at the Florida Bar, and a dynamic person that will answer wonderful questions and give you information. So we have the ability to pick his brain today and go through several things. We're going to go through three items today that is in the top of everybody's mind. The discussion of non-compete clauses, the discussion of changes into overtime rules that is going to be really important for the future, and especially to get ahead of that, and the EEOC announcement of reinforcement guidelines. But truly, I want to start with the overtime rules, because sometimes this can be very confusing for those. And I know, Aaron, you've had a lot of questions. So let's do that first, Aaron, and tell us briefly, we all know that these things can be five pages long just to say what the rule is now. But tell us what the new overtime rule is.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, there were a number of pronouncements by the FTC, the DOL, Department of Labor, and the EEOC, all at the end of April of this year. And that's going to, in my view, create a cultural shift for a number of companies. So taking the overtime rule in brief, as everybody sort of knows, people are either eligible for overtime or they're not eligible for overtime, depending on their classification. For people who are not eligible for overtime, which usually they're called exempt under the case law, those are usually your professionals, your administrative assistants, your executives. There is both a salary test and a duties test. Thankfully, the Department of Labor did not change any of the duties test, or we'd be here for 2 hours explaining the changes. Instead, they only concentrated on the salary test. What does that mean? So if you have somebody that you've classified under an executive, administrative, or professional goal, currently, as long as you pay them annually $35,568, and depending on how you do that, we won't go into that, those people can be exempt. So even after they work 40 hours, you don't owe them any other additional monies because they're exempt from obtaining overtime. Starting July 1, which literally is in, less than 30 days, the salary threshold for those workers is going up to $43,888. That's an $8,300 increase. And starting in January of 2025, it's going to increase to $58,656, which basically is a $23,000 jump from where you are today. So what does this mean? This means that if you have somebody who's a manager, let's say, and you're currently paying them $40,000 and they work 60 hours in a week, you're not paying them any additional money. After July 1, if you don't raise their salary an additional roughly $4,000, they're going to be entitled to overtime. And so when they work those 60 hours again, you're going to have to pay them their salary for 40 hours and pay them overtime and figure out what their overtime rate is for 20 of those hours. And so in a month, if they actually do that, that's 80 hours of overtime, which is time and a half. So people understand, this is not about changing somebody's title, right? You can call somebody whatever you want, senior executive, manager, the like. But if you don't pay them the threshold amount, they're entitled to overtime. Somebody's asked to explain the rules, so I'm going to do this again very briefly. Currently, it's $35,568. July 1, it's going to go up to $43,888. And January 1, it's going to go up to $58,656. I'm looking at my notes off to the side. So what you're going to have to decide is, assuming you have, let's assume, I'm making this up, but 10 managers who are classified as exempt in your organization, and you want to keep them as exempt starting January 1, you're going to have to find another $230,000 to move their salary up, depending on where you are. Now, lots of times, and I say this in general, lots of times managers are making more than the minimum $35,000. A lot of them are making 45, some of them are making 60. All of that's fine. What the pressure is going to be that you're going to need to figure out is, one, you're going to need to do an audit. You're going to have to figure out where your exempt employees are on the pay scale. But in addition, think about this. I have a manager who reports to a senior VP. The manager is now in January of 2025 going to have to make at least $58,000. Let's assume the senior VP only makes $60,000. Well, now there's going to be pressure on your organization by the senior VP to say, well, wait, if I'm a senior VP and you just move somebody up, let's assume you only moved them up $10,000, right? They were currently making 45. You're moving them to the 58. The senior VP is going to say, well, why didn't I get a salary raise? Why didn't I get a? In addition, you're going to have to decide on some of these administrative assistants who currently you're paying, let's say, $40,000, and they're exempt. Starting January 1, you're going to have to move them $18,000. It may not be worthwhile to your organization, but if you have people who were exempt, right, not eligible for overtime, again, I'm assuming in your organization they met the duties test and they've met the salary test, and you want to keep them. If you don't want to keep them as an exempt employee, you're going to be telling people who normally don't fill out timesheets that they're now going to have to fill out timesheets. And why is that? Because you're responsible as the employer, and most of you who have signed up here are either employers or HR professionals. You're responsible for calculating their hours worked and their overtime and having those records. So I'm going to give you sort of an example, a different example than a salary test, but one I dealt with some years ago. I had a company, they had a trucking fleet manager. Trucking fleet manager managed 2 employees, which meant under the duties test, they were perfectly fine. And the trucking fleet manager, as an exempt employee, could decide, hey, I'm going to leave today at 2. I'm going to a doctor's office. He'd tell his boss he left, he came back. He never had to clock in, he never had to clock out. Automation made it possible for him to get by with only 1 employee. So once he went down to one employee, while he was still the trucking manager, under the rules at the time, the duty rules, he was no longer exempt. He was no longer not eligible for overtime. He had to, because he didn't oversee enough employees. And I had to have a conversation with this gentleman who was in his 60s, who had never filled out timesheets, that he had to now start clocking in and clocking out just like his subordinate. And that if he left, he was now off the clock and he wouldn't be paid for those same doctor visits that for years he had been going to and never saw a reduction in his pay.
Right.
So what you have to remember is, if you decide to not move somebody up in salary, either in July 1 or January, you're going to have a conversation with these people that the good news for them is they're entitled to overtime now if they work more than 40 hours in a week. The bad news for them and for you is they're now going to have to provide you with time records that they probably have never done before. In addition to moving the salary test when for these executive, administrative, and professionals, the EAPs, they've also moved the salary for what we call highly compensated employees. And here the money is going to be even worse. So currently, if you pay somebody and designate them as a highly compensated employee, and they make at least $107,432, they are not entitled to overtime. Now, I'm not going to get into the rules about how many highly compensated employees each organization gets. Just going to assume if you have one, you're paying them correctly. Come July 1, those people are going to need to be paid $132,964, right? So basically a $25,500 increase in 2 weeks for them to remain exempt, meaning not eligible for overtime. And come January 1, they have to be paid $151,000, which is a $44,000 increase from where we are today.
So Aaron, I have a question. Just let me just get this through here. This is very valuable because, and I'm seeing the chats come through. So if someone today is making $110,000 as a we'll just take highly compensated first. $110,000 today, highly compensated, $120,000. On July 1st, if they're not making $132,964, you're going to have to tell that person that they get overtime. True? Okay, now wait just a second here, folks. Think about this. And then if that person is not making 152, let's say, just round it up a little bit, on January 1st, then they are also going to have to put in overtime. So the impact of this, and this is not just Florida, Aaron, correct?
This is, and remember, Florida doesn't have its own wage and hour laws. Certain counties do, but that's not applicable. That means that we are covered only by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the federal act, and that's what the Department of Labor decided to monkey with in terms of salaries.
So, Aaron, if you go and think about this, if you take the EAP employees, which is the employees that are exempt, or even with the highly compensated employees, the management team, okay, tip number one, the management team will need to have a fact sheet. They're going to need to have talking points because people are going to start to come to them based on what you do and how they do this. Next, it is also, I can't emphasize enough, Aaron, the cultural aspect of I was exempt, now I've got to put in overtime. Now, some people may welcome that because you're not going to change their title. Title has nothing to do with it. You can be the director of whatever function, a manager of whatever function, a vice president of whatever function. The title and the task has nothing to do with it. It is actually having somebody say, well, guess what? I put in 80 hours a week. Now, the other thing is, how do you log that with something that you've not been doing? You know, are you going to clock in and clock out all these people? How are you going to keep that record? Especially if you have a big team. You have to,
So
how
let's
do you do
take
that,
this.
Aaron?
Yeah. So let me say this, and this has been showing up in the chat. So, and so people reading this, look, lots of people who are currently not required to do time cards and not required to account for their time. It's sort of historically shown that when you tell them they're now going to have to, even though they're not changing their duties, they're not changing your responsibilities, you're not changing anything, right? If they got to approve $1 million deals, that's not the case. They will see it as a demotion unless you ease them into it. And you only have 2 weeks to ease them into it right now, and another 6 months to ease them into it if you don't meet the January numbers.
Right.
But let me talk about something else that's sort of practical. Let's assume you have somebody that's highly compensated. They're making $110,000. For usual ease, and because I'm not an accountant, I'm going to make this simple. 40 hours at 50 weeks is 2,000 hours a year. And I say that because with holidays and everything else, most people, if they are working roughly 50 weeks out of the year. So 40 hours, 50 weeks, 2,000 hours.
Right.
Okay. When you divide $110,000 by 2,000, you get, right, 50.5. And if I've
Yep.
done the math correctly, and somebody's going to correct me, but if I was to pay that person overtime, I'd be paying them $82.50 an hour. Right?
Yeah.
So somebody's 110. So if they worked, think of it this way. If they worked only 40 hours of overtime in the year, then if you kept them at 110 and paid them overtime, roughly you'd be paying them an extra $3,500. So maybe
Right.
it's not worth it, okay,
Right.
to move them up and deal with the headache of them having to put in timesheets and basically going back. And remember, a lot of people talk about this. This is not about people who are on salary, are exempt from overtime, and people who are hourly get overtime. That's not the way the rules work. The rules work about pay, regardless of how you get that pay. So please, anybody who's on this, disabuse yourself of the notion that if I'm paying somebody a salary, they're never entitled to overtime.
Right. Aaron,
Because
let me
that's
ask you
not the way it
this.
works.
And it's
Okay?
regardless of company size, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't matter if you have 2 people in your organization or 100,000.
Well, the FLSA rules apply really, but then the county rules come into play and they basically create the same issue. So basically, if you have 5, basically the best way to say this is, if you have 5 people or more, pay attention. Because the other thing is, most of your competitors are going to be having to do this. And when somebody is working for you and you're paying them 110, and they now find out that their friend who has the same job at a competitor is now having to be paid 151 because they have 25 employees, well, people are going to come to you and say, why aren't I getting paid more? Right? And if you say, well, I don't have to follow the new overtime rules because we're too small, most of those people, that's going to fall on deaf ears.
Right. Because
Okay,
because it's really not too small, right, Aaron? It's
correct.
not.
Correct. So,
and someone's put in the chat, Aaron, retention issues, engagement issues. So
right.
again, this checklist of doing an audit, finding out where you can, getting that CFO involved so they understand who's on this cusp. And then you have to make a decision. Are you going to do this for everybody? Are you going to be selective? Are you going to do overtime? And how are you going to do it? It's a big cultural shift. And what I personally think, Aaron, is also these manager talking points about how this is rolled out and how it's done, if you have to do this, is going to be critical for you to bring that team together, because that leader, as we say in my world at Wright, that leader has to be the coach on this. that leader has to understand it as well as you understand it.
And remember, this is going to, depending on how you decide to do this is going to have an impact on your bottom line.
Exactly.
And it's going to have an impact on your culture because of the pressure on employees to change their work habits, right? Because if you decide not to move up an administrative assistant, let's assume you're paying them $45,000, you think that's fine. You're not going to move them up to 58. When that assistant is working for, let's say, the president, right, of the company, and the president of the company is there at 7 o'clock at night, and he turns and he tries to see John or Jane or Jim or whoever is their administrative assistant, and they're not there because you've sent them home because you do not want them to earn overtime. Whereas previously they've been sitting there because they were exempt. The president's going to say, where's my assistant? And you're going to say, well, it was cheaper for the company to hire somebody else to come in the evenings for evening coverage. And the president's going to say, because I've had this in organizations, I don't want to work with that new person. John or Jane or Jim know exactly what I mean when I say things. I don't want to train another person. This is a problem. Now, let me just finish this because we're going to have to move at timing. But let me just say this. Think of this. If you have somebody who's making $110,000 and you decide not to move them up, and they only work 10 hours additional, so they're working 50 hours consistently, pretty much throughout the year, each week, an extra 10 hours. Okay, at 50 weeks, 10 hours, right? So 500, right? 500 hours of additional time at $82.50 an hour for that additional 500 hours. You're basically paying them $40,000.
Right. You're paying.
So it may be, if you do the calculation, it may be a no-brainer to move them up to 151 and save yourself all the headaches. But maybe it's not.
Even for the EAP employees, maybe it's not. So your idea of an audit and finding out who's there is important. And plus, and you can't screw with people's vacation times and things like that. Don't be going there saying that that's going to help you out either, right? So this is something that we could do another webinar on, but I've got so many people wanting to know about non-competes, Aaron.
So let's talk about that.
Let's talk about non-competes. Tell us what's happening.
Sure. So unless you are, unfortunately, and I don't mean this unfortunately, but unless you were under a rock, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, announced on April 23rd, everything happened this week in April, that it was banning post-employment non-compete clauses going forward for most organizations. Now, I'm not going to get into which organizations aren't necessarily covered. I'm going to just talk about where we are. So basically the FTC, and I'm going to try to give you both sides of the argument. So for most employers, if we're really going to be fair, we have overused non-competes. All right. The non-compete, for those of you, who, just so we understand what we're talking about, it's an agreement that an employee signs, usually when they start working or maybe as they're leaving work, which basically says, I won't go to work for a competitor for a certain amount of months in a certain geographic area for a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Unfortunately, there are a number of states who have decided, California being the biggest one, years ago, that non-competes were anti-competitive. They prevented people from moving around. They suppressed wages. And therefore, California put in a law that said, regardless of where the non-compete is supposed to be, if you come to California and try to enforce it, we're going to tell you it's tissue paper. We're never going to enforce it, except in very rare occasions. The FTC has basically adopted California's position. And the reason for that is, in part, is that we as employers are to blame for the overuse of non-competes, right? So it makes sense for an executive like Tammy to have a non-compete. It makes sense for a professional working in-house like myself to have a non-compete. It doesn't make sense for the person at Tammy's organization who's the receptionist to have a non-compete. But there's probably one. because people just overuse them. And so the FTC basically said, instead of just being selective, we're going to ban them. Now, they are not banned if you are a business owner and you sell a business. Okay. And I'm not really going to talk about that one because that happens very rarely. But if you have somebody who's the business owner who's working in the business and they decide to sell their stake in the business or they sell the business totally, the buyer can seek a non-compete, and the FTC says in those situations that's okay. Other than that, basically the FTC is taking the position that unless you identify a senior executive, and there is a significant definition about what a senior executive is, it is a policy-making individual, policy-making, not running. They must be policy-making, who makes more than $151,000 last year. So let's just make sure we understand. Unless you have a senior executive, so if I have two senior vice presidents, again, my trucking person and let's say my head of production, my trucking person may be a senior vice president, but under the FTC's definition, he's not a senior executive who will be covered and be allowed, the employer would be allowed to have a non-compete with them because they have no policy-making authority in my example. They just tell the trucks where to go. They don't decide which trucks they're going to buy, and they don't even have anything about doing it. But my VP of production, so these two gentlemen, or gentleman, a man, a woman, both women, doesn't matter. They're sitting at the boardroom and they are their voice is equally heard. But for the purposes of the FTC, only the person from production who gets to say, I've decided we're going to stop making square widgets and we're only going to make round widgets. He's a senior executive. I can have a non-compete with him as long as I'm paying him $151,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Aaron, that policy has to be and a non-compete has to be proven. Like the thing in California, they're even going back, and Meta and the social media people are going back because that person that's disputing that made policy, and it was written that he had the authority to do that. So that don't just say because they're in some senior meeting that they've made policy, right? Because
it has to be part of their job description, and they have to exercise it.
Yeah.
Okay. So leaving this alone, everybody else, according to the FTC, who has a non-compete, okay, going forward, they will not be enforceable. So if you sue somebody, the lawyer sues somebody for leaving and going to a competitor, and they try to raise the non-compete, and they're not a senior executive that they've identified under the way the rules work, the FTC's view is that the employer trying to enforce the non-compete, that would be illegal.
Right.
Okay.
Aaron, talk about in the policy about solicitation and all of that.
Okay, so we're gonna talk about the ways you can avoid this, right? But let me just finish this thought. So there is a question as to whether or not judges will actually follow the FTC rules about making them illegal. And there was a lawsuit out in the Northern District of Texas in which people have challenged, including the National Chamber of Commerce is a party to that, challenged the FTC's rulemaking authority. We don't know where that's going. But if not, this rule is going to come in September 1. Now, if somebody leaves now and has a non-compete before September 1, the FTC rule says, yes, the employer can still enforce it. Okay, so what do we do, right? And why were non-competes so easy for employers? It's really easy to decide whether somebody violated a non-compete. If I go and work for Burger King today, and 2 weeks later I go to work for McDonald's, most courts are going to understand I went to work for a competitor. Without a non-compete, here are some of your employer options that you can have. You can still have a non-solicitation agreement. So a non-solicitation agreement says that somebody leaving an employer agrees not to solicit, to encourage either customers or employees of the former employer to leave. Okay, so that's one. Confidentiality provisions still exist, right? So if you have a confidentiality provision in your agreement that says, I'm in a position where I get confidential information, I get business plans, business generation plans, I have to keep those confidential, all right? In addition, in Florida, we have the advantage of somebody identifying certain information the company may have as trade secrets under a statute. And if you identify them as trade secrets, they also can be protected. But you have to identify them. You can't do it after the fact. You can't say everything I have is a trade secret, even if the person occupied your office of planning and development. Not everything that goes across their desk is a trade secret, okay?
Yeah.
So let's talk about this. And in addition, under the federal rules, you can try to put copyright protection in place to copyright the materials, because only a copyright owner has a right to use those materials unless there's a license. Now, here's the problem with all of the alternatives to a non-compete, that you as an HR person is going to have a headache when your senior executives say, somebody, Joan left us and now she's working for a competitor and we think we're losing business and we want to sue her, okay? Here's a problem. Number one, it's very hard to figure out whether somebody's solicited. Here's a good example. I'm a doctor, Tammy's a doctor. We have a practice together in North Miami Beach. I decide I want to live closer to where I work, and I say to Tammy, thank you very much. I'm going to leave the practice. I'm going to open up a shop in Miami Beach, only about 10 miles away. But I agree, I'm not going to solicit any of our employees who currently work for Tammy. I'm not going to solicit Diana, who's our nurse practitioner, none of that. And I'm not going to solicit any customers or patients. I go to my office, and lo and behold, in 3 months, Tammy sees a diminution of 25% of her patients, all of whom have now become my patients. And Tammy calls me up and says, you bastard, you promised you wouldn't solicit. And I say, I didn't solicit anybody. I saw Mrs. Greenblatt in the grocery store. She had just come to see you, Tammy. And she said, where are you, Dr. Tandy? I would rather have you. And I had to say, I opened my own practice in Miami Beach. That is not considered a solicitation. I didn't say to Mrs. Greenblatt, come work, come to me. I didn't do any of that. But if Mrs. Greenblatt goes and tells all of her friends that Dr. Tandy is now in Miami Beach, we should go there. It's easier, it's safer. I like Dr. Tandy's method. Tammy is going to lose half her practice. And I have never violated the non-solicitation law.
So it's very hard to prove that you actually solicited somebody.
Correct.
Because unless you have an email in your hand that somebody will give you and say, so-and-so called me.
Because my putting up on Facebook that I've opened my own office is not, according to the courts, considered a solicitation. As long as I don't call Mrs. Greenblatt and say, Mrs. Greenblatt, you've always liked me better than Tammy. I've moved, come join me. I haven't solicited. Mrs. Greenblatt has decided on her own. Now, doctors are a little bit more difficult than other kind of customers because the courts are also deferential to the idea that somebody's healthcare provider should be somebody they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, but it's still the same example. Thing. It's a great example just to make it really gel for everybody. Now, Aaron, one question is do you necessarily, if you have non-competes with all of this language in it, of non-solicitation and all this, do you have to revamp it and get everybody to re-sign, or can you just leave what's on file?
So according to the FTC, as long as it's part of an agreement, you can just redline out the non-compete and everything else can stay. Now, whether or not a court will agree to that, sometimes they're so intertwined, and this is where you might have to do another audit and look at your own documents. If they're so intertwined, then the courts have basically thrown out the entire provision. In a number of agreements I have a section that says non-compete, non-solicitation, confidentiality, and then each subparagraph is one of the same. So if a court decides to X one out, the rest of them stay, they're not just the type. But let me talk about confidentiality because this is the other problem. So I'm the head of production for a company. I know that my company who's in Macon, Georgia, is looking at opportunities in Kentucky. I go to a competitor, and the competitor says, I'm in a meeting with the competitor, and the competitor says, we're going to be opening, we think Lexington, Kentucky, and other parts of Kentucky are fertile grounds for us because there's nobody there, and nobody looks like they're going to be there. And I have to go like this. I can't say anything. Wink, wink, nod, nod. I can't violate my confidentiality agreement, but wink, wink, nod, nod. You might want to rethink that. I've now violated my confidentiality provision, but get a court to prove that. Okay?
Right.
That's why everybody loved non-competes, because it was pretty much black and white. I worked for Burger King today. 2 days later, I'm walking in the office of McDonald's. Let me also say, because I saw it in the chat question that just popped up, if there is current litigation going on about an enforcement of a non-compete, the FTC rule does not stop that litigation. So any litigation that starts before September 1 is not affected by the new rule. And who knows what the lawsuit in Texas is going to do. But
Wow.
that's where we are. And you should monitor the various sites, employment practice sites, because they're monitoring this Texas case. But currently, given where we are, it's not clear, because the case is only in the preliminary stages, as to whether or not there will be some type of national injunction, which the Supreme Court has basically said we don't favor, or there's going to be some challenge. So you better start getting ready, because I would hate for people to think that the courts are going to save or extend out the deadline and put in an injunction, and you get to August 25th, and now you haven't done anything. Because there's also timeframes for identifying and telling people if they are really a senior executive who's non-compete, you as an employer are tending to going to enforce. And that in and of itself could be a whole different lecture about how that timing rules work. We're not going to get into that. So with our remaining time, let me spend 5 minutes, Tammy, if I can,
Sure.
about the EEOC guidance document, which also came out on April 29th. Like I said, April was like I don't know if the agencies all decided, hey, the end of April was a good day to leave all of these things. So what did the EEOC guidance document do? So previously, for those of you who practice in this area, and as you know, as I said before, Florida really doesn't have much in the way of employment laws unless you're in the agricultural field or the computer field. And if you're not in either of those deals, or you're a minor employee, right? So recently there were some changes to those rules that affect 17 and 18-year-olds. We're not going to talk about that. Florida doesn't have really employment law, so we're stuck with the federal. As a result, while there is a Florida's Civil Rights Act, which prevents people from discriminating, in most cases, the courts in Florida have said cases decided under the federal Title VII, which is pretty much the umbrella Discrimination Act, right? So Title VII prevents discrimination as a race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, national origin, age. There's also the Age, Anti-Discrimination Act, the ADA. But leaving all of this, Florida basically says we're going to defer to whatever the federal courts say when they decide Title VII and other cases, to the most part. So the EEOC guidance is very important. Previously, the EEOC had guidance on each little subsection of Title VII. There was a guidance as to discrimination on national origin. There was a guidance on discrimination as to religion. There's a guidance, okay? You get the point. And people were like, some of that guidance hadn't been updated in 20 years. And so what the EEOC decided was they were going to put in one document pretty much all of the guidance that they expected for anti-harassment. Okay. And that's basically what it's called. It is called the Enforcement Guidance on Harassment in the Workplace. So not particular harassment, harassment in general. It was issued on the 29th. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's EEOC-CVG-2024-1. It is their first 2024 guidance document. It can be found on the website. I hate to tell you, it's over 188 pages. So have fun reading it. I had to. But basically, it consolidates all of the guidance from the EEOC as it relates to harassment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, national origin, age, disability, and genetic information.
Wow.
It's basically going to be your Bible. So you're not going to have to compare this guidance that was in 2000 and the guidance in 2006 and the other one and figure it out. It's all there for you.
It's all there.
It's all there.
We'll put that in the chat so they can download that and read the 200 pages. As I always say, but with the overtime laws, I don't know how, I always say from midnight to 6, I'm not doing anything. But now with all these overtime laws, I don't know if we can say that anymore. So,
Yes.
Aaron,
Yes.
we've got some questions here. We've got about 10 more minutes, and
Sure.
It's unbelievable, fascinating what you're talking about. But back to the salary question, there was one about commissions. What about people who make commissions and make this if they're highly compensated or they're exempt? What about people on commission? Is it regardless of how you pay them?
So remember, and there's also some guidance about computer technicians, which are their own category, and it depends on whether they're hourly or salary. But with commissions, the rule of thumb really is if you pay somebody commissions, and remember, it's not about how you pay them, it's what you pay them, then commissions and bonuses may count. Okay? Because remember, certain bonuses don't count under the case law. You can't take somebody who you failed to pay overtime to throughout the year and decide that you're going to give them $100,000 bonus at the end of the year and then turn around when they sue you for not paying them overtime timely, that, hey, at the end of the year, I trued it all up.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, that doesn't work. An employer who does that will be sued for failing to pay overtime timely, because that's the rule. So a bonus would not prevent that lawsuit. Similarly, depending on how you pay the bonus, when you pay the bonus, and whether the bonus is discretionary, the Department of Labor will determine, not me, the Department of Labor will determine whether or not it will meet the new thresholds for pay. Okay? Because there's all sorts of rules the Department of Labor has for when a bonus is considered part of compensation and when it's discretionary and not considered compensation, right? Because think of it this way. Let's assume that you have somebody who's highly compensated, but you're paying them a base salary of 90 with a bonus of $50,000, right? Or 45. They can make half, their salary in commissions, and at the end of the year, they'll be paid $135,000, but it's discretionary. So you've never paid them. You've always identified them as exempt. And we get to, let's say you're December 31st, and you've had a bad year and you don't pay them. You've got to go back because they've never met the threshold. And you now have to go back and get time records for a whole year, have to retroactively pay them. It's a mess. So if you're going to use commissions, again, this is just my advice. It's commissions have to be paid timely on a set schedule so that it can be considered part of the compensation, so that when you project them out, you will have somebody who meets the threshold. Because if you don't do that, you are setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah. So commissions count is what you're saying.
Commissions do count as long as you do it correctly. bonuses count as long as you do it directly. For example, if I have a longevity bonus, meaning if I get the bonus regardless of what happens, and that bonus gets paid on December 25th, a longevity bonus, which has no discretion, could count as part of my compensation. So I could be paid $110,000. And under the new rules, if I have a $45,000 retention bonus that comes to me on the 25th,
Yeah.
I would be considered under certain rules to be covered even under the January 1 bump up.
Bump up. There's a
Right.
question here, Aaron, that says, if an exempt employee's salary was increased because they've been working excess hours consistently, then down the line, if they've stopped working excess hours, could we decrease the salary?
Again, how you decide to pay people is your own business. But the purpose is, are they entitled to overtime or not? And here's sort of the other rub. It looks suspicious to the Department of Labor if you have somebody who is exempt for certain months and not exempt for other months, and you can't explain why. Now, in seasonal workers, that happens, right? Seasonal workers, there's a whole different kind of rules and may happen. But for the most part, if you decide that you're going to pay somebody, let's say an EAP, you're going to pay them the $58,000 and they're not working out, and you decide to, almost as a demotion, drop their salary to $50,000, they're now going to be entitled to overtime starting January 1. And you're going to have to do those rules. You're going to have to get them to do time cards. They're not going to be able to just decide to set their own hours. They're not just going to be able to walk out to that doctor's appointment. They're going to be covered under all the other employees who are entitled to overtime, regardless, again, how you pay them. Of course, most people, unfortunately, and again, I say this wrongly, think of themselves as either hourly or salaried, and think if they're salaried, they don't get overtime. But that's not the way the rules work.
Not the way the rules work.
Yeah, it's very rare, but there are hourly employees who are paid so much per hour that they are actually exempt from overtime. It is a very rare occurrence. Okay.
Yeah.
I know of only one in Florida, and I'm not sure if even the doctor is still practicing, but he was making $8,000 an hour.
Whoa.
Okay. But he only worked like 8 hours a week. He was a eye surgeon somewhere in the middle of Florida. And he was exempt from overtime because he was paid so high, so much.
So highly.
Right. His hourly rate was so high. Right.
Wow.
He did an operation and he got $32,000. Right. It was 4 hours a week.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow. Well, if an eye doctor that is that wonderful, we'll pay him $40,000 to make sure you can see.
Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, Aaron, it's almost 1 o'clock here, and I have to tell you that every time I talk to you, I learn something. I'm grateful for your friendship and your partnership here with the Greater Miami. I want you to be highly successful next year, because I think you will be as you come into that. And remember, I am a phone call away, and I'm not going anywhere to be able to support you in the chamber, and Right Management's not going anywhere. We're going to be right here by your side. So, thank you so much, Aaron, for everything you've done and for today.
Thank you very much, Tammy. I want to take this opportunity to again thank Tammy for her leadership over the last 2 years for the HR and Professional Committee here at the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce. Tammy does a wonderful job and is a wealth of knowledge and is just a terrific person. And we are really blessed to have her in our community. And as part of all of this, I want to thank again Career Source, Florida Blue, and of course, Barry University for the SHRM credits. I want to thank everybody else for attending and listening to me drone on. But I hope people took things away and it was helpful. We'll be doing these type of webinars again. Robert Ortiz is going to be my vice chair starting actually now. I think we started
Yeah.
But our next webinar series for the committee won't be out until September, October, because we take the summer off. But I really want to thank everybody. Please look for our next webinar series. And of course, please, if you want, join our committee. We're always happy to have you. Alicia Thompson, who's on, can give you the information to join us. We welcome new voices, and we thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And don't forget our chamber friends, Alicia and everybody there that supports us, and all of them, and from Alfred to Alicia. Thank you so much. We appreciate you, and everyone have a fantastic, and don't forget, go on the Greater Miami Chamber. This has been recorded. You're going to want to write down all of those numbers, and please stay blessed, and please stay dry, and please stay safe. Until we see each other again, thank you.
Take care.
Thanks all.